Montana Territory, 1875. The train whistle pierced the quiet afternoon air as it rolled into Whitewater Station, a mere collection of wooden buildings huddled against the vast Montana landscape. Vaughn Ryder stood on the platform, shifting his weight from one boot to the other, his hat in his hands. At 25, he had the lean, muscled build of a man who'd spent his life on horseback, with sun-bronzed skin that contrasted with eyes the color of a summer sky. His sandy blonde hair fell in waves that he'd attempted to tame with water before coming to town. His ranch was 15 miles outside of Whitewater, 500 acres of good grazing land that he'd worked to the bone for 3 years to establish. 500 acres and a two-room cabin that had felt increasingly empty with each passing season. "Train's running late," said the station master, an older man with a drooping mustache, typical for this line. Vaughn nodded, saying nothing. His throat felt too dry for speech. The paper in his breast pocket crinkled when he moved a letter from Miss Victoria Palmer of Boston, Massachusetts, age 22, unmarried, educated, seeking a husband in the Western Territories. His response to the matrimonial advertisement had been impulsive. After watching his neighbor's wife bring their 5th child into the world, after seeing how the hardened rancher softened at the sight of his growing family, Vaughn had written the letter in a moment of rare vulnerability. The frontier was no place for a man alone, that's what he'd told himself. A practical arrangement, nothing more. He'd convinced himself that he merely needed a woman to cook, to clean, to help with the chickens and the garden. To provide children eventually. Love wasn't part of the equation. Love belonged in the novels that gathered dust on the shelves of his childhood home back in Illinois. Out here, partnerships were practical matters. A man and woman joined forces to survive, that's all. The distant rumble of the locomotive grew louder. Vaughn placed his hat back on his head, then removed it again. He'd never met the woman, yet in a matter of minutes she would become his responsibility. His wife, after a brief ceremony with the circuit preacher who'd arrived in town yesterday. The train rounded the bend, black smoke billowing from its stack. As it slowed, screeching against the rails, Vaughn stood straighter, squinting at the passenger cars. Passengers began to disembark, a businessman in a dark suit, a family with 3 small children, an elderly couple. He searched for a young woman traveling alone. Miss Palmer had described herself as having auburn hair and a disposition suited to frontier life. In his mind, she'd become someone practical and sturdy. Someone who wouldn't balk at the isolation of ranch life or the endless work. When the last passenger stepped onto the platform, a gentleman in a bowler hat, Vaughn felt a sinking in his stomach. He approached the conductor, who was checking his pocket watch. "Excuse me," Vaughn said, removing his hat. "I was expecting a passenger, Miss Victoria Palmer from Boston." The conductor frowned, flipping through some papers. "Palmer. Let me see," he ran a finger down a list. "Yes, she boarded in Chicago 3 days ago, should have been on this train." "Could she have missed it?" "No, sir, she definitely boarded." "Perhaps she disembarked at an earlier stop." Vaughn's brow furrowed, without sending word. The conductor shrugged, already turning away. "Can't say, sir, we've got a schedule to keep." As the train prepared to depart, Vaughn stood on the platform, hat in hand, staring at the empty tracks stretching eastward. The practical arrangement he'd counted on had vanished like morning mist. It shouldn't have mattered, she was a stranger after all, but the disappointment sat like a stone in his chest. He was turning to leave when the station master called out, "Mr. Ryder. There's a telegram for you." The yellow paper trembled slightly in Vaughn's hand as he read. "DELAYD stop, robbed on train, stop, stranded, SWETWATER station, stop, no funds to continue, stop, Victoria Palmer." Sweetwater was 2 stops back, a half-day's ride. Vaughn read the telegram again, his mind racing. She'd been robbed, stranded, alone in a town known for its rough elements. "When's the next eastbound train?" he asked the station master. "Not until Thursday." Today was Monday. Vaughn looked toward the livery stable where his horse was boarded. 5 hours of daylight left. If he pushed hard, he could reach Sweetwater by nightfall. "Something wrong with your bride, Ryder?" The station master looked genuinely concerned. Vaughn folded the telegram carefully. "She's not my bride yet." The sensible thing would be to wait for Thursday's train, send a telegram back telling her to board it, but the thought of a young woman alone in Sweetwater for 3 days didn't sit right. An hour later, Vaughn was riding east, the rhythmic pounding of his horse's hooves matching the beating of his heart. The endless Montana sky stretched above him, and the grasslands rolled away in every direction. He'd left word with the preacher to expect a delay, packed enough supplies for two on the return journey. He told himself it was the practical thing to do, the honorable thing. But as the miles passed beneath him, Vaughn Ryder couldn't deny the flutter of something else, something that felt dangerously like hope. Victoria Palmer sat on a hard bench outside the Whitewater Station, her back straight despite her exhaustion. Her trunk, the only possession the train robbers hadn't taken, sat beside her, its brass fittings catching the late afternoon sun. Her reticule, money, and jewelry were gone, along with the small pistol her father had insisted she bring. At 22, Victoria had never been without resources. The daughter of a successful Boston merchant, she had grown up with comfort, education, and the assumption that doors would open for her. But her father's sudden death had revealed debts that consumed the family business and home. Her mother had gone to live with a sister in New York, and Victoria, with no marriage prospects and no inheritance, had made the decision that had led her here, answering a matrimonial advertisement from Montana Territory. Her auburn hair, usually arranged in careful curls, had partly escaped its pins during the ordeal. Her traveling suit of deep green wool, chosen to make a good first impression, was wrinkled from 3 days on the train. She'd managed to keep her gloves clean, though, and wore them still, as if this small reminder of propriety could shield her from the harsh reality of her situation. The station master had been kind enough, but his small office had no accommodations for stranded travelers. The town's only hotel was reportedly full due to a cattle buyers' convention. He'd suggested the boarding house down the street, but without money, Victoria had nowhere to go and no way to wire her intended husband. The westbound train passed through about 2 hours ago, the station master had told her. Your telegram would have reached Whitewater by now. If this Ryder fellow is coming, he'll be here by nightfall. If not, he'd let the sentence hang. Victoria touched the locket at her throat, the only piece of jewelry the robbers had overlooked. Inside was a miniature portrait of her parents on their wedding day. She'd come too far to turn back, even if she'd had the means to do so. The sound of approaching hoofbeats made her look up. A rider was coming fast down the main street, his horse's coat dark with sweat. He pulled up in front of the station, swinging down from the saddle in a fluid motion that spoke of years in the saddle. He was younger than she'd expected. Tall and broad-shouldered, with a face that might have belonged in a painting, strong jaw, straight nose, and eyes that reminded her of the Massachusetts sky in summer. A few days' worth of light stubble shadowed his jaw. His clothes were trail-dusty but of good quality, a tan canvas jacket over a blue cotton shirt, dark trousers tucked into worn boots. He removed his hat as he approached, revealing sandy blonde hair that curled slightly at the ends. "Miss Palmer." Victoria stood, smoothing her skirts. "Mr. Ryder." He nodded, his expression a mixture of relief and wariness. "Are you hurt, ma'am?" "No, just relieved to see you." She tried to smile, but her lips trembled. The reality of her situation, penniless, dependent on a stranger in a strange land, overwhelmed her momentarily. Vaughn noticed her trunk. "Is this all your belongings?" "Yes, the robbers took my reticule with all my money and papers. I'm afraid I have nothing left except what's in this trunk." He nodded, processing this information. "We should find you something to eat before the ride back. It's a long journey to Whitewater." "Mr. Ryder," Victoria said, her voice steady despite her inner turmoil, "I understand if this changes things. I'm not the bride you were expecting. I have no dowry, no money to contribute to our arrangement." Vaughn studied her face for a long moment. He'd expected someone practical, maybe a bit plain. Instead, he found himself looking at a woman whose beauty seemed almost out of place in this dusty frontier town. Her eyes were the deep green of pine forests, set in a face of delicate features and fair skin touched by a few freckles across the nose. Her auburn hair, despite its disarray, shone with hints of gold in the fading light. But it was the determined set of her chin, the way she faced her situation without tears or hysterics, that truly caught his attention. "Miss Palmer, our arrangement stands if you still wish it," he said finally. "I didn't ask for money when I wrote to you. I asked for a partner willing to face frontier life." Relief flickered across her features. Then I haven't come all this way for nothing. No ma'am, you haven't, he hesitated. Though I should warn you my place is modest, 500 acres but the house is small, 2 rooms, I've been building on a third but it's not finished yet. Victoria nodded. I didn't come west expecting luxury, Mr. Ryder. Something in her voice made him believe her. He picked up her trunk with ease. Let's get you some food, the cafe down the street should still be open. As they walked side by side down Sweetwater's dusty Main Street, Vaughn found himself stealing glances at the woman who would soon be his wife. She carried herself with dignity despite her circumstances. There was a strength about her that had nothing to do with physical power. The frontier broke many women, the isolation, the hardship, the endless work. He'd seen it happen to his neighbor's first wife, who'd returned east after just 6 months, unable to bear the loneliness. But something told him Victoria Palmer might be different. For the first time since sending his response to the matrimonial advertisement, Vaughn allowed himself to wonder if this practical arrangement might become something more. The cafe was small but clean, with checkered tablecloths and a motherly woman serving simple fare. Victoria ate the stew and biscuits with appreciation, realizing she hadn't had a proper meal since the train robbery the previous day. The robbers came through our car just after midnight, she explained between bites. They took money, jewelry, anything valuable. A man who resisted was pistol-whipped. Vaughn's jaw tightened. Did they threaten you? One of them grabbed my arm when I hesitated to hand over my reticule, she admitted. But I wasn't harmed. Their eyes met across the table, and Victoria saw something protective flash in his gaze. It was a strange feeling to have someone concerned for her welfare after months of facing her troubles alone. The local sheriff did nothing, Vaughn asked. Victoria shook her head. He took statements when we arrived but said the robbers would be long gone. I think he was more concerned with clearing the stranded passengers out of his town. Some lawmen out here aren't worth the badges they wear, Vaughn said quietly. As Victoria finished her meal, she found herself studying the man across from her. His hands were calloused, his face weathered from sun and wind, but there was a gentleness in how he spoke to the waitress, how he made sure Victoria had enough to eat. His letters had been straightforward, almost businesslike. The man himself seemed to have hidden depths. Tell me about your ranch, she said. A smile touched his lips, transforming his face in a way that made Victoria's heart skip unexpectedly. It's in a valley with a creek running through it. Good water, good grass. I run about 200 head of cattle, plus some horses. The cabin sits on a rise with a view all the way to the mountains. Pride colored his voice. Lands paid for. I worked 6 years for another rancher before striking out on my own 3 years ago. And you manage it alone. I hire 2 hands during roundup and branding. Otherwise, it's just me, he hesitated. And my dog, Buck. Victoria smiled at the mention of the dog. What kind is he? A big yellow mutt, good with cattle, better company than most men. When they finished eating, the sun was touching the horizon. Vaughn paid the bill and they stepped outside into the cooling air. It's too late to start back to Whitewater tonight, he said. We should find you a room for the evening. Victoria's face fell. But I have no money for lodging. I'll handle it, Vaughn said firmly. We'll leave at first light tomorrow. The boarding house had a single room available, a narrow chamber under the eaves with a sloped ceiling and a small window overlooking the street. The landlady, a sharp-eyed woman with iron-gray hair, looked disapprovingly at them until Vaughn explained the situation. We're to be married in Whitewater, he said. Miss Palmer was robbed on the train. The woman's expression softened slightly. Well, that's a proper shame. The room is 50 cents for the night. I'll be staying at the livery with my horse, Vaughn added, counting out the coins. After arranging to meet at dawn, Vaughn left Victoria at the boarding house door. She watched him walk away, his tall figure cutting a straight path through the growing shadows, and felt a curious mix of relief and apprehension. Tomorrow they would reach Whitewater. Tomorrow she would marry this man she barely knew, binding her life to his in this wild territory. It wasn't the life she'd imagined for herself, but Victoria Palmer had learned that life rarely followed one's careful plans. She touched the locket at her throat, thinking of her father. He'd always told her that character revealed itself in times of adversity. Today, she'd glimpsed Vaughn Ryder's character and found it reassuring. Dawn was breaking over the eastern plains when Victoria descended the boarding house steps. Vaughn waited beside his horse, her trunk already secured behind the saddle. A second horse, a sturdy bay mare, stood beside his own mount. "I bought her from the livery," he explained, seeing Victoria's questioning look. "Figured you'd need a horse of your own on the ranch anyway." Victoria approached the mare cautiously. She'd ridden in Boston's parks occasionally, but those had been gentle, well-trained mounts. This horse eyed her with an intelligence that was slightly intimidating. "She's trail-broke and even-tempered," Vaughn said. "The livery owner assures me she'll do for a lady." Victoria stroked the mare's neck. "Thank you. That was thoughtful." "Can you ride astride?" Vaughn asked, then immediately looked embarrassed. "I'm sorry, that's forward of me. It's just that a side saddle wouldn't be practical for the journey and I didn't think to bring one." Victoria smiled. "I've only ridden side saddle, but I'm willing to learn." Riding astride in a dress proved challenging, but Victoria managed by gathering her skirts and tucking them around her legs as modestly as possible. Vaughn was patient, showing her how to hold the reins properly and use her knees to direct the horse. "She responds to light pressure," he explained. "No need to pull hard on the bit." By the time they left Sweetwater, the sun was fully up, promising a warm day. The trail followed the railroad tracks for several miles before branching northwest toward Whitewater. They rode side by side when the trail allowed, Vaughn pointing out landmarks and naming the distant mountain ranges. Victoria was struck by the vastness of the landscape, so different from Boston's crowded streets and buildings. The sky seemed enormous, a dome of perfect blue stretching from horizon to horizon. "It's beautiful," she said softly. "I never imagined such space." Vaughn glanced at her. "It can be overwhelming at first. Some folks find it lonely." "Is that how you feel about it, lonely?" He considered her question longer than she expected. "Sometimes," he admitted finally, "but mostly I find it peaceful. The land doesn't ask anything of you except respect." They stopped at midday by a small stream. Vaughn helped Victoria dismount, his hands strong and sure at her waist. The brief contact sent an unexpected warmth through her, and she stepped away quickly, suddenly conscious of their isolation. He pretended not to notice her discomfort, busying himself with unsaddling the horses and letting them drink. From his saddlebags he produced a cloth-wrapped bundle of bread, cheese, and dried apple slices. They ate sitting on rocks beside the stream, the only sounds the rushing water, the horses' occasional snorts, and the wind through the prairie grass. "Tell me about Boston," Vaughn said eventually. "I've never been east of the Mississippi." Victoria described her hometown, the cobblestone streets, the harbor filled with ships from around the world, the gaslit theaters and busy markets. As she spoke, she realized how distant that life already seemed, like a story read in a book rather than her own past. "And your family, you mentioned in your letter that your parents had passed." Victoria's expression clouded. "My father died 6 months ago. The business had debts I never knew about. My mother went to live with her sister in New York." She twisted the edge of her sleeve. "There was nothing left for me there." Vaughn nodded, understanding in his eyes. "My parents had a farm in Illinois. Both died of fever when I was 17. My sister married and moved to California. I headed west because I wanted land of my own." He gestured to the open country around them. "Out here, a man can build something from nothing." "Is that what you've done, built something from nothing?" Pride touched his features. "I started with 50 acres and 10 cattle. Now I have 500 acres and 200 head, with more calves coming this spring." He looked directly at her. "It's a good life, Miss Palmer, hard but good." "Victoria," she said, "if we're to be married tomorrow, you should use my given name." A slight smile curved his lips. "Victoria," he repeated, as if testing the feel of it. "And I'm Vaughn." When they resumed their journey, something had shifted between them. The formal distance had lessened, replaced by a tentative companionship. Victoria found herself watching Vaughn as he rode, the confident way he handled his horse, the alertness with which he surveyed the landscape, the occasional smile that transformed his serious expression when he pointed out a hawk circling overhead or a distant herd of antelope. By late afternoon, muscles Victoria hadn't known existed were protesting the hours in the saddle. Though she tried to hide her discomfort, Vaughn noticed. "We'll stop early tonight," he said. "Make camp by that stand of cottonwoods ahead." It's still 3 hours to Whitewater, and you're not used to riding. I don't want to delay us, Victoria began, but Vaughn shook his head. Better to rest and finish fresh tomorrow. The preacher will wait. The campsite he chose was beside a small creek, sheltered by a grove of cottonwood trees. Vaughn unsaddled the horses with practiced efficiency, then gathered wood for a fire while Victoria stretched her aching legs. I'll set up a sleeping area for you under that big tree, he said, nodding to a massive cottonwood with sweeping branches. I'll stay on this side of the fire. Victoria felt a flush rise to her cheeks at the implication. Of course they wouldn't share accommodations until after the ceremony. Still, the reality of their situation, alone together in the wilderness, struck her anew. Vaughn seemed to sense her unease. I know this isn't proper by Eastern standards, he said carefully, but I give you my word as a gentleman, you're safe with me. I believe you, Victoria said, and realized she meant it. Despite knowing him for less than a day, she trusted Vaughn Ryder's integrity. There was a steadiness about him that inspired confidence. As dusk fell, Vaughn built a small fire and prepared a simple meal of bacon, beans, and coffee. Victoria watched him move around the camp, noting how he seemed more at ease here in the open than he had in town. You mentioned 2 rooms in your cabin, she said as they ate. Will one be mine? Vaughn looked up, surprise in his eyes. Well, I assumed. That is, I thought we'd share the bedroom, being married and all. A flush crept up his neck. But if you prefer your own room until we know each other better, I can sleep in the main room. Victoria set down her tin plate, gathering her courage. Mr. Ryder Vaughn, I should be clear about something. I answered your advertisement because I needed security after my father's death. I came west prepared to be a wife in every sense of the word. She met his gaze steadily. I don't expect romance, but I do expect respect and honesty between us. If those terms are agreeable to you, I see no reason to delay the usual arrangements of marriage. Vaughn stared at her, something like admiration in his expression. I appreciate your directness, he said finally, and yes, those terms are agreeable. He hesitated, then added, I never expected romance either, but I do believe a husband and wife should be partners in all things. The conversation shifted to practical matters, the running of the ranch, the planting season ahead, the neighbors few and far between. As night deepened, Vaughn spread a bedroll under the big cottonwood for Victoria and showed her how to use his spare blanket. It gets cold at night, even in summer, he explained. The temperature drops fast once the sun goes down. Victoria settled onto the bedroll, watching as Vaughn made his own sleeping place on the other side of the fire, just as he'd promised. The stars emerged overhead more than she'd ever seen in her life, a dazzling canopy of light against the velvet darkness. They're magnificent, she whispered. Vaughn looked up from banking the fire. One of the best things about the territory, he agreed. You can see clear to forever on nights like this. As she drifted toward sleep, Victoria found herself wondering what other discoveries awaited her in this vast new land, and with this quiet, steady man who would soon be her husband. They reached Whitewater by mid-morning the following day. The town was larger than Sweetwater, with a proper main street lined with wooden buildings, including a general store, a bank, a hotel, and a saloon. Several side streets branched off, revealing modest homes and businesses. Vaughn led the way to a white clapboard church at the edge of town. The preacher should be here, he said. And I arranged for witnesses before I left. Victoria suddenly felt the enormity of what they were about to do. In less than an hour, she would be Mrs. Vaughn Ryder, married to a man she'd known for barely 2 days. The sensible part of her mind reminded her that this was no different from what she'd planned all along, a practical arrangement with a decent man who could provide stability. But as she glanced at Vaughn's profile, noting the tension in his jaw and the careful way he helped her dismount outside the church, she realized something had changed. This was no longer merely a practical arrangement between strangers. In their short time together, she'd come to respect this man, perhaps even to like him. Are you certain about this? Vaughn asked quietly, standing close beside her. It's not too late to change your mind. Victoria smoothed her travel-worn dress, wishing she had something more appropriate for her wedding day. I'm certain, she said. Are you? He nodded once decisively. I am. The church was cool and dim inside, with simple wooden pews and clear glass windows that let in the morning light. The preacher, a thin man with spectacles and a kind smile, greeted them warmly. "Mr. Ryder. I was beginning to wonder if you'd changed your plans." "Just delayed, Reverend," Vaughn said, introducing Victoria. "This is Miss Palmer." Two middle-aged women sat in the front pew, obviously waiting to serve as witnesses. They introduced themselves as Mrs. Hodges, the general store owner's wife, and Mrs. Simmons, the schoolteacher. "We brought a few things, Mrs. Hodges said, producing a small bouquet of wildflowers tied with ribbon. "Every bride should have flowers." Mrs. Simmons stepped forward with a lace handkerchief. "Something borrowed," she explained, pressing it into Victoria's hand. Touched by their kindness, Victoria fought back unexpected tears. "Thank you, that's very thoughtful." The ceremony itself was brief and simple. Victoria stood beside Vaughn before the altar, the borrowed handkerchief clutched in one hand, the wildflowers in the other. The preacher spoke of duty, respect, and partnership, practical virtues for a practical union. When the time came to exchange vows, Victoria's voice remained steady. "I, Victoria Palmer, take thee, Vaughn Ryder, to be my lawfully wedded husband." Vaughn's voice, by contrast, was rougher than usual, catching slightly on the words. His hand, when he slid a simple gold band onto her finger, was warm and calloused. "By the power vested in me," the preacher concluded, "I now pronounce you husband and wife. You may kiss your bride." Victoria looked up at Vaughn, suddenly shy. His eyes met hers, asking a silent question. She gave a small nod. His kiss was gentle and brief, a light pressure of his lips against hers that ended almost before she could respond. Yet something stirred in her at that simple contact, a flutter of awareness that left her momentarily breathless. After signing the marriage certificate and accepting congratulations from the witnesses, they emerged from the church into the bright Montana day as husband and wife. Victoria Ryder, no longer Palmer. The name felt strange, yet somehow right. "I need to pick up some supplies while we're in town," Vaughn said as they walked toward the general store. "And perhaps you'd like to choose some fabric, Mrs. Hodges mentioned they received a shipment of calico last week." Victoria touched the sleeve of her travel-worn dress. "That would be wonderful. I'm afraid my trousseau is rather limited." Inside the store, Vaughn moved efficiently through his list: flour, coffee, sugar, ammunition, a new axe handle. Victoria found herself drawn to a bolt of blue calico with tiny white flowers. "That would suit you," Vaughn said, appearing beside her. "The color matches your eyes." Surprised by the personal observation, Victoria looked up at him. "Do you think so?" A slight flush touched his cheekbones. "I do. Get enough for 2 dresses." By the time they left the general store, their purchases loaded into saddlebags and Victoria wearing a new bonnet, a wedding gift from the Hodges. It was early afternoon. "We should get on the trail," Vaughn said. "I'd like to reach the ranch before dark." As they rode out of Whitewater, Victoria found herself both apprehensive and curious about the place that would now be her home. The trail led through rolling grasslands dotted with wildflowers, following a stream that widened as they traveled. In the distance, mountains rose blue and majestic against the sky. "That's the northern boundary of my property," Vaughn said after they'd ridden for about 2 hours, pointing to a line of trees ahead. "The creek runs through the middle of the ranch. The cabin is about 3 miles in, up on that rise." Victoria shaded her eyes, trying to see where he pointed. "It looks beautiful." "It's good land," Vaughn agreed. "The valley floods in spring, bringing fresh soil to the hayfields. The south pasture stays green even in August when everywhere else is browning." His pride in the land was evident in every word. This wasn't just property to him, it was home, a place he'd built with his own hands and vision. As they crested a small hill, the cabin came into view. It sat on a gentle rise overlooking the valley, with mountains framing it in the distance. Smoke rose from the stone chimney, and a large yellow dog bounded from the front porch, barking enthusiastically. "Buck must have smelled us coming," Vaughn said, a smile in his voice. "Thompson's still here too, that's good." "Thompson?" "My neighbor's son. He offered to look after things while I went to town." Vaughn whistled, and the dog raced toward them, circling the horses with evident joy. "Whoa, Buck. Settle down, boy." They dismounted near a corral attached to a small barn. A gangly young man of about 17 emerged from the cabin, waving. Everything's fine, Mr. Ryder, the boy called. Fed the stock and kept the fire going like you said. Appreciate it, Thompson. Vaughn helped Victoria down from her horse. This is Mrs. Ryder. The boy's eyes widened. You really did it. You got married. Vaughn's arm came around Victoria's shoulders in a protective gesture that surprised her. I did. Mrs. Ryder came all the way from Boston to join me. Thompson removed his hat. Pleased to meet you, ma'am. My pa says your husband's the best cattleman in the territory. Victoria smiled at the boy's earnestness. It's nice to meet you, Thompson. After the boy left, riding toward his family's ranch 5 miles away, Vaughn led Victoria toward the cabin. Buck pranced alongside them, occasionally pushing his nose against her hand. He likes you, Vaughn observed. The cabin was larger than Victoria had expected from Vaughn's description. Built of squared logs with a stone foundation, it had a covered porch across the front and glass windows, a luxury on the frontier. A third room was under construction at the back, the frame already in place. I've been adding on, Vaughn explained, following her gaze. Thought we might need the space eventually. His ears reddened slightly at the implication of children. Inside, the main room served as kitchen, dining area, and living space. A stone fireplace dominated one wall, with a cooking hearth and iron crane for pots. A sturdy table with 4 chairs sat in the center, while a rocking chair and small bookshelf occupied a corner near the window. Everything was clean and orderly, if plain. The bedroom is through there, Vaughn said, indicating a doorway covered by a curtain. I'll bring in your trunk. While Vaughn tended to the horses, Victoria explored what was now her home. The bedroom contained a large bed with a patchwork quilt, a chest of drawers, and a washstand with pitcher and basin. Another window looked out toward the mountains. She ran her hand over the quilt, noting the careful stitching. Did you make this? She asked when Vaughn entered with her trunk. He shook his head. My mother did, one of the few things I brought from Illinois. Victoria unpacked her few belongings, 3 dresses besides the one she wore, undergarments, a nightgown, a hairbrush and small mirror, a Bible that had belonged to her grandmother, and a framed daguerreotype of her parents. Vaughn watched from the doorway. Is that all you have? The robbers took my jewelry and money, she reminded him. But yes, I traveled light. I sold most of my possessions to pay for the train ticket. Something like anger flashed in his eyes. You deserved better than to arrive with nothing. I'm here, Victoria said simply. That's what matters. As evening approached, they fell into a surprisingly comfortable routine. Vaughn showed Victoria the pantry and explained how the pump at the sink worked, another luxury he'd installed just the previous year. Together, they prepared a simple supper of salt pork, biscuits, and canned peaches. Over the meal, Vaughn outlined the rhythms of ranch life, the early mornings and long days, the seasonal cycles of calving, branding, haying, and roundup. Victoria listened attentively, asking questions that revealed her eagerness to learn and contribute. I've never lived on a ranch, she admitted, but I'm not afraid of hard work. The garden needs attention, Vaughn said. And if you're willing to learn, I could use help with the cattle occasionally, especially during calving season. Victoria nodded, grateful he assumed her capable rather than fragile. I'll learn whatever is necessary. After supper, Vaughn stepped outside to check on the horses one last time. Victoria used the opportunity to change into her nightgown and robe, her heart racing at the thought of the night ahead. They were husband and wife now, legally bound. The bed they would share loomed large in her mind. When Vaughn returned, he paused in the doorway, seeing her in her night clothes. I can sleep in the main room tonight, he offered, if you'd prefer time to adjust. Victoria gathered her courage. That isn't necessary. We're married now. Vaughn nodded, turning to wash at the basin while Victoria slipped into bed. She heard him change behind her, the soft sounds of clothing being removed and folded. When the mattress dipped under his weight, she held herself very still. Good night, Victoria, he said softly, extinguishing the lamp. In the darkness, she was acutely aware of his presence beside her, the warmth of his body, the sound of his breathing. This man was her husband, yet still largely a stranger. Good night, Vaughn, she whispered back. Sleep came slowly, but eventually exhaustion from the journey overcame her nerves. Her last conscious thought was that the bed was far more comfortable than she'd expected for a frontier cabin. Victoria woke to sunlight streaming through the window and the smell of coffee. The space beside her was empty, the blankets neatly turned back. For a moment, she felt relief mingled with disappointment. Vaughn had not pressed his marital rights during the night. She dressed quickly in her second-best dress, a navy blue cotton with white collar, and arranged her hair in a simple knot at the nape of her neck. When she emerged from the bedroom, she found Vaughn at the stove, frying bacon. "Good morning," he said, glancing up. "Coffee's hot if you want some." "Thank you," she poured herself a cup from the pot on the stove. "You should have woken me, I didn't mean to sleep so late." "You needed the rest after our journey." He slid the bacon onto plates alongside slices of bread. "Besides, you'll have plenty of early mornings ahead. Ranch work starts before dawn most days." They ate breakfast together at the table, discussing plans for the day. Vaughn needed to check on the herd in the north pasture, while Victoria wanted to assess the garden and begin setting the cabin in order. "I'll be back by midday," Vaughn promised. "The pantry's stocked if you need anything." After he left, Victoria stood on the porch, watching him ride away with Buck trotting alongside. The morning was glorious, clear and cool, with birds singing in the trees along the creek. Mountains rose in the distance, their peaks still snow-capped despite the summer warmth. For the first time, she had a chance to truly absorb her surroundings. The cabin sat on a gentle rise, providing a view across the valley. A kitchen garden lay to one side, somewhat overgrown but still productive. A chicken coop stood beyond it, where several hens scratched in a fenced yard. The barn and corrals were to the other side, with a smokehouse and tool shed nearby. Everything was orderly and well-maintained, if simple. Victoria rolled up her sleeves and set to work. She spent the morning cleaning the cabin from top to bottom, noting with approval that Vaughn kept a tidy home for a bachelor. The garden yielded fresh carrots, beans, and early potatoes, which she gathered for their midday meal. By the time Vaughn returned, she had prepared a stew and was setting the table. He paused in the doorway, his expression unreadable as he surveyed the transformed cabin. Curtains had been hung, surfaces polished, and wildflowers arranged in a jar on the table. "Something smells good," he said finally. Victoria smiled, pleased by his notice. "I found vegetables in the garden. I hope you don't mind that I picked them." "Mind? They're as much yours as mine now." He washed at the basin by the door, rolling down his sleeves. "The garden's been neglected. I'm better with cattle than crops." Over lunch, Vaughn described the north pasture and the condition of the herd. Victoria listened with genuine interest, asking questions about the cattle operation and how the ranch functioned. "I'm planning to expand," Vaughn admitted. "There's good land to the east that's unclaimed. If I can increase the herd by 50 head this year and again next, I'll have enough capital to file the claim." "That's a sound plan," Victoria said. "My father always said to build slowly and on solid ground." Vaughn looked pleased at her understanding. "Exactly, too many ranchers overextend and lose everything in a hard winter or a market downturn." In the afternoon, Vaughn showed Victoria around the property more thoroughly. The hay meadows that provided winter feed for the cattle, the best fishing spots along the creek, the stand of pine trees where he harvested wood for the winter. With each step, Victoria felt her appreciation growing, not just for the beauty of the land, but for the careful way Vaughn had built his ranch. "You've created something remarkable here," she said as they stood on a ridge overlooking the valley. "All by yourself." Vaughn's face softened with pride. "It wasn't easy. The first winter nearly broke me. Blizzards for weeks, temperatures so cold the creek froze solid. I lost 15 head before spring. But you persevered." "I did," he glanced at her. "This land gets in your blood, becomes part of you." As the days passed, Victoria found herself settling into the rhythms of ranch life. She rose before dawn with Vaughn, preparing breakfast while he tended to the morning chores. They worked separately throughout the day, Vaughn with the cattle and horses, Victoria with the garden, chickens, and household tasks, coming together at mealtimes to share their progress. The nights remained chaste, though Victoria was increasingly aware of Vaughn's presence beside her in the darkness. Occasionally their hands would touch as they passed the salt at dinner, or their shoulders would brush as they worked side by side, and she would feel a flutter of awareness that both confused and intrigued her. This wasn't the marriage she had imagined as a girl, with romantic declarations and passionate embraces. It was quieter, more measured, a partnership built on mutual respect and common purpose. Yet Victoria found herself watching Vaughn when he didn't notice, admiring the strength of his hands as he repaired a fence or the quiet concentration on his face as he read by lamplight in the evenings. A week after their wedding, Victoria was kneading bread dough when Vaughn entered the cabin unexpectedly, his expression troubled. "Something wrong?" she asked, wiping flour from her hands. "Thompson just rode by with news. There's a cattle buyer coming through next week. Several ranchers are planning to drive their marketable stock to Whitewater for sale." Victoria nodded, waiting for him to continue. She sensed there was more. Vaughn ran a hand through his hair. "It's a good opportunity. Prices are high right now. I could sell 20 head and have enough to buy that eastern parcel outright." "That sounds like good news," Victoria ventured. "It would mean being gone for 5 days." The drive to town, the sale, and the return. He met her eyes directly. "I don't like the idea of leaving you alone so soon." Victoria straightened her shoulders. "I'll be fine. Buck will be here, and you said yourself that Thompson checks in regularly." "It's not just about safety," Vaughn admitted. "We're still getting to know each other. 5 days is a long time to be apart when we've only been married a week." Touched by his concern, Victoria stepped closer. "I understand your hesitation, but this is a business opportunity that benefits both of us. You should go." Vaughn studied her face for a long moment. "You're sure?" "I'm sure," Victoria smiled reassuringly. "Besides, think of how much you'll have to tell me when you return." The decision made, Vaughn spent the next few days preparing for the cattle drive. He repaired tack, checked the cattle he planned to sell, and made arrangements with 2 neighboring ranchers to travel together. On the morning of his departure, Victoria rose even earlier than usual to prepare a hearty breakfast and pack food for his journey. Vaughn ate quickly, his mind obviously already on the trail ahead. "Remember to keep the door barred at night," he instructed as they walked to where his horse waited, "and the rifle is loaded just in case." "I'll be careful," Victoria promised. "You focus on getting a good price for the cattle." Impulsively, Vaughn reached out and took her hand, his calloused fingers warm against hers. "I'll miss you," he said, the words clearly not coming easily to him. Victoria's heart quickened. "I'll miss you too." For a moment she thought he might kiss her, truly kiss her, not the brief, formal touch they'd shared at their wedding. Instead, he squeezed her hand once before releasing it and mounting his horse. 5 days, he reminded her, 6 at the most. Victoria stood on the porch, waving as Vaughn rode away to join the other ranchers with their small herds. Buck whined beside her, clearly unhappy about being left behind. "I know how you feel," she told the dog, scratching his ears, "but we'll manage just fine together." The first day alone passed quickly enough. Victoria cleaned the cabin thoroughly, then tackled the mending that had accumulated, shirts with torn sleeves, socks with holes, a quilt that needed patching. In the late afternoon, she walked to the garden and harvested vegetables for her solitary dinner. The silence of the cabin that evening was profound. Even with Buck's companionable presence at her feet, Victoria felt the emptiness keenly. She hadn't realized how much she'd grown accustomed to Vaughn's quiet company, his deep voice discussing the day's work, the solid presence of him across the table, the sound of his breathing beside her at night. On the second day, Victoria decided to explore the property more thoroughly. With Buck as her guide, she walked to the creek and followed it downstream, discovering a small waterfall and pool that Vaughn hadn't shown her. The beauty of the spot, clear water tumbling over moss-covered rocks, surrounded by wildflowers, took her breath away. She sat on a boulder, trailing her fingers in the cool water and imagining bringing Vaughn here upon his return. The thought startled her. When had she begun thinking of sharing experiences with him, rather than simply fulfilling her duties as his wife? When had his approval and company become something she actively sought? That night, as Victoria prepared for bed in the empty cabin, thunder rumbled in the distance. Buck paced restlessly by the door, whining occasionally. "It's just a storm," she told the dog, though her own nerves were on edge. Thunderstorms in Boston had been muffled by surrounding buildings and the company of family. Here, with nothing between her and the elements but logs and a shingle roof, the approaching storm felt more immediate and threatening. Lightning flashed, illuminating the bedroom in stark white light, followed by a crack of thunder that seemed to shake the cabin's foundations. Rain began to pelt against the roof and windows, driven by gusting wind. Buck howled mournfully and jumped onto the bed beside Victoria. Vaughn wouldn't approve, she told the dog, but made no move to push him off. His warm presence was comforting as the storm raged outside. Eventually, lulled by the rhythmic sound of rain and Buck's steady breathing, Victoria drifted to sleep. She woke to sunlight and birdsong, the storm having passed during the night. Buck was already at the door, waiting to be let out. Victoria rose, wondering if the storm had affected Vaughn and the cattle drive. Would the trail be muddy, the stream crossings swollen and dangerous? These worries accompanied her through her morning chores. By midday, she had worked herself into genuine concern, imagining accidents and delays. This is ridiculous, she told herself firmly. Vaughn knows this land, he's experienced. He's fine. To distract herself, Victoria decided to tackle the unfinished room at the back of the cabin. Vaughn had mentioned it was intended to be a bedroom, perhaps for guests or someday for children. The walls were framed but not yet enclosed, the floor only partially laid. Victoria examined the construction carefully, noting the sound craftsmanship. Vaughn had a good eye for building, it seemed. A workbench in the corner held tools and supplies, nails, a hammer, a saw, measuring implements. Without conscious decision, Victoria found herself picking up the hammer. By sunset, she had laid 3 more floorboards, carefully measuring and nailing them into place as she had seen her father's workmen do years before. The physical labor was satisfying in an unexpected way, creating something tangible, making a visible difference. When she finally set the hammer down, her arms aching pleasantly from the unaccustomed work, Victoria felt a surge of pride. Vaughn would be surprised when he returned. The thought of his reaction made her smile. She was coming to value his good opinion, to look forward to his rare smiles of approval. It was a strange realization for a woman who had entered marriage with purely practical expectations. The 3rd and 4th days passed in a similar fashion, Victoria dividing her time between normal chores and working on the floor of the new room. Buck became her constant shadow, accompanying her everywhere and sleeping beside her at night. On the afternoon of the 5th day, Victoria was in the garden when Buck suddenly raised his head, ears perked. A moment later, he bounded toward the trail, barking joyously. Victoria straightened, shading her eyes against the sun. A rider was approaching. Vaughn returned as promised. Her heart leaped with unexpected eagerness as she hurried to meet him. Vaughn dismounted when he reached the yard, catching Buck's front paws as the dog jumped up in greeting. "Down, boy." "Yes, I missed you too." His eyes found Victoria standing by the garden gate with her apron full of tomatoes. Something in his expression shifted, a softening, a warmth that hadn't been there before. "Welcome home," Victoria said, surprised by the emotion in her own voice. Vaughn approached, taking in her appearance, hair escaping its pins, cheeks flushed from gardening, apron stained with dirt. "The place is still standing, I see," he said with a hint of teasing. "Did you doubt it would be?" Not for a moment, his smile was genuine. "How did you manage?" Victoria gestured toward the cabin. "Come inside and I'll tell you over dinner. You must be hungry after your journey." As they walked together, Vaughn's hand brushed against hers, perhaps accidentally, perhaps not. Either way, Victoria felt the brief contact like a spark against her skin. Over a meal of fresh vegetables and the last of the salt pork, Vaughn described the cattle sale. Prices were better than expected. "I sold all 20 head for top dollar," pride colored his voice, "enough to buy the eastern parcel and have some left over." "That's wonderful news," Victoria said sincerely. "You must be pleased." "I am," he hesitated. "I bought something in town, for you." From his pocket he withdrew a small package wrapped in brown paper. Surprised, Victoria untied the string and unwrapped the gift. Inside was a silver hairbrush with a delicate floral pattern on the back. "It's beautiful," she breathed, running her fingers over the smooth silver. "I noticed you didn't have much," Vaughn said, almost apologetically. "After the robbers took your things, I thought you might like something pretty." The thoughtfulness of the gesture touched Victoria deeply. "Thank you, I shall treasure it." After dinner, as Vaughn was unpacking his saddlebags, Victoria led him to the unfinished room. "I worked on this while you were away," she said, suddenly shy about her efforts. Vaughn stared at the newly laid floorboards, then at Victoria. "You did this by yourself?" She nodded, uncertain of his reaction. I hope I didn't overstep. I wanted to be useful, and I remembered watching my father's carpenters when I was a girl. For a long moment, Vaughn said nothing. Then, unexpectedly, he laughed, a rich, warm sound that Victoria realized she'd never heard from him before. Most women would have embroidered a handkerchief or baked a pie, he said, still chuckling. My wife lays floorboards. Is that disappointing? Disappointing, Vaughn shook his head, amusement giving way to something more serious. Victoria, it's remarkable, you're remarkable. Before she could respond, he stepped closer and cupped her face in his hands. The touch was gentle but sure, his calloused fingers warm against her skin. Victoria's breath caught as Vaughn bent his head and kissed her. Unlike their wedding kiss, this was no brief, ceremonial contact. His lips moved against hers with slow deliberation, as if he were memorizing the feel of her. Victoria found herself responding instinctively, her hands coming to rest on his chest, feeling the steady beat of his heart beneath her palms. When they finally parted, Vaughn rested his forehead against hers. I missed you, he confessed quietly, more than I expected to. I missed you too, Victoria whispered back. That night when they retired to their bedroom, the air between them felt charged with new awareness. As Vaughn extinguished the lamp, Victoria gathered her courage. Vaughn, she said softly in the darkness, I am your wife in name. I would be your wife in truth as well. She heard his sharp intake of breath, felt the mattress dip as he turned toward her. Are you certain? I am. His hand found hers beneath the quilt, fingers intertwining. Then come here, he murmured, drawing her into his arms. In the weeks that followed, Victoria and Vaughn settled into a new rhythm, still partners in work and purpose, but now also partners in a deeper sense. Their initial reserve gave way to growing affection, expressed in small gestures and quiet moments. His hand at the small of her back as they walked together, her fingers brushing his hair from his forehead, shared smiles across the dinner table. The practical arrangement they had both expected was evolving into something neither had anticipated, a genuine bond built on mutual respect and deepening feeling. Summer faded into autumn, bringing cooler temperatures and changing colors to the valley. The cattle were rounded up from summer pastures and brought closer to the ranch for the coming winter. Hay was stacked in the barn, firewood split and piled beside the cabin, vegetables harvested and preserved. Victoria threw herself into these preparations with enthusiasm, learning from Vaughn and occasionally surprising him with knowledge gleaned from books or her own experimentation. She proved adept at preserving food, canning vegetables from the garden, drying apples, smoking meat from the wild game Vaughn hunted. The unfinished room progressed steadily as they worked on it together in the evenings, laying the remaining floorboards, enclosing the walls, adding a window that faced the sunrise. They didn't discuss its purpose explicitly, but both understood it was preparation for the family they hoped to have. One crisp October morning, Victoria woke feeling unusually tired. As she rose to prepare breakfast, a wave of dizziness overtook her. She steadied herself against the bedpost, taking deep breaths until the sensation passed. Vaughn, already dressed and preparing to head out for morning chores, noticed immediately. Are you all right? He asked, concern etching his features. Just a moment of lightheadedness, Victoria assured him. I'm fine now. But the episodes continued throughout the day, dizziness, fatigue, a strange sensitivity to smells. By evening, Victoria had a suspicion about what might be happening. She counted back the weeks since her last monthly courses, realizing they were overdue. That night, after Vaughn had fallen asleep beside her, Victoria lay awake, one hand resting on her still flat abdomen. Could it be? After only a few months of marriage, the possibility filled her with a mixture of excitement and trepidation. She waited another week, wanting to be certain before saying anything to Vaughn. When her courses remained absent and the morning dizziness continued, Victoria knew it was time to share her news. They were sitting before the fire after dinner, Vaughn reading a newspaper from town while Victoria mended a shirt. Setting aside her sewing, she took a deep breath. Vaughn, she began, her voice soft but steady, I believe I'm with child. His head jerked up, the newspaper forgotten in his hands. What, when, how sure are you? Reasonably sure. It's been 6 weeks since my last monthly time, and I've been feeling unwell in the mornings. Vaughn set the newspaper aside and moved to kneel before her chair. His face held an expression Victoria had never seen before, a mixture of wonder, pride, and something like fear. "A baby," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Our baby." Victoria nodded, her own emotions threatening to overwhelm her. "Yes, our baby." Unexpectedly, Vaughn reached out and placed his hand gently on her stomach. The gesture was so tender, so reverent, that tears sprang to Victoria's eyes. "Are you happy?" she asked, needing to hear the words. "Happy?" Vaughn looked up, his eyes suspiciously bright in the firelight. "Victoria, I never thought I'd have this, a wife I've come to care for deeply, a child on the way, a real family." He swallowed visibly. "Yes, I'm happy, more than I can say." He rose and pulled her to her feet, wrapping his arms around her. "We'll need to finish that room sooner rather than later," he murmured against her hair. Victoria laughed softly. "We have some time yet. The baby won't arrive until late spring, I think. Still, there's much to do. The ranch is a good place for a child to grow up, but I want everything to be ready." His protective instinct was clearly engaged, his mind already racing ahead to preparations and plans. "We'll be ready," Victoria assured him, resting her head against his chest. Together. As winter descended on the valley, bringing snow that transformed the landscape into a pristine white expanse, Victoria and Vaughn worked to prepare both the ranch and themselves for the changes ahead. The third room was completed, furnished with a small bed that Vaughn crafted himself and curtains that Victoria sewed from fabric purchased in town. Victoria's body changed gradually, her condition becoming visible first to her husband's attentive eyes and eventually to the few neighbors they saw during the winter months. Mrs. Thompson, mother of young Thompson who had watched the ranch during their wedding journey, became a regular visitor, bringing advice and small gifts for the expected baby. "First babies are special," she told Victoria during one such visit, watching as the younger woman knitted a tiny blanket. "They change everything." "I'm a bit nervous," Victoria admitted. "Being so far from town, from a doctor. Most babies out here are born with just a midwife or experienced neighbor to help," Mrs. Thompson reassured her. "I've delivered 12 children in this valley besides my own 5. When your time comes, send Thompson for me. I'll be here." This promise eased Victoria's mind considerably. While she trusted Vaughn with her heart and her future, the thought of him facing childbirth alone was daunting. He had demonstrated remarkable competence in all aspects of ranch life, but this was one area where experience mattered. Christmas came, bringing with it a gentle snowfall and a rare visit from neighbors despite the weather. The Thompsons arrived by sleigh, bearing gifts and holiday food to share. 2 other ranching families joined them, turning the small cabin into a warm hub of celebration. Victoria, now visibly expecting, found herself the center of much attention and advice. The women examined her knitting and sewing for the baby, offering suggestions and stories of their own experiences. Vaughn watched these interactions with evident pride, occasionally catching Victoria's eye across the room with a look of such contentment that it made her heart swell. Late that night, after their guests had departed and the cabin was quiet except for the crackling of the fire, Vaughn presented Victoria with a gift, a rocking chair he had secretly built in the barn during the short winter days. "For when the baby comes," he explained as she ran her hands over the smooth, polished wood, "every mother needs a rocking chair." Victoria blinked back tears at the thoughtfulness of the gift. "It's perfect," she said, easing herself into it. The chair moved with a gentle, soothing rhythm. "Our child will love being rocked to sleep here." "Our child," Vaughn repeated, as if still marveling at the words. He knelt beside the chair, placing one hand on Victoria's rounded abdomen. "Sometimes I can hardly believe this is real, that you're here, that we're having a baby." He looked up, meeting her eyes. "When I sent that advertisement, I never expected." "Neither did I," Victoria admitted. "I answered thinking only of security, of survival. And now," Victoria placed her hand over his, "now I can't imagine any other life, any other husband." Vaughn's expression softened. "Victoria, I need to tell you something I should have said before now." He took a deep breath. "I love you, not just because you're carrying my child or because you're a good partner on the ranch. I love you for yourself, your courage, your strength, your heart." The words, so long unspoken between them, hung in the air like the most precious of gifts. Victoria felt her throat tighten with emotion. "I love you too," she whispered. I think I have for some time now. Vaughn rose, pulling her gently from the rocking chair into his arms. His kiss was tender yet passionate, conveying everything words could not. Later, as they lay together beneath the quilt his mother had made, Vaughn's arm protectively around her, Victoria reflected on the journey that had brought them here. From strangers bound by practical arrangement to true partners united by love, a transformation neither had expected but both now cherished. Outside, snow continued to fall softly over the valley, blanketing their ranch in pristine white. Inside, the fire burned low, casting golden light over the cabin that had become not just a house but a home, their home, soon to welcome a new life into the world. Spring arrived late that year, the snow lingering in shaded hollows even as green began to emerge in the valley. Victoria's time drew near, her body heavy with the child that would soon join their family. Vaughn became increasingly protective, reluctant to leave her alone for even short periods. "You can't hover over me every minute," Victoria told him with fond exasperation one April morning. "The cattle need tending, and I'm perfectly capable of managing for a few hours." Vaughn frowned, clearly torn between duty to the ranch and concern for his wife. Thompson could check the herd. "And you trust his judgment on which cows might be ready to calve?" Victoria raised an eyebrow. "Go, Buck will stay with me, and I promise to remain close to the cabin." Eventually, Vaughn relented, riding out to check on the spring calves but returning by midday rather than spending the full day in the pastures as he normally would. "Everything all right?" he asked, finding Victoria seated in her rocking chair, sewing a tiny shirt. "Everything is fine," she assured him. "The baby is active today, that's all." Vaughn knelt beside her, placing his hand on her belly as had become his habit. The baby kicked against his palm, eliciting a grin that transformed his usually serious face. "Strong," he commented, "like his mother." "Or her father," Victoria countered, enjoying the ongoing debate about whether their child would be a boy or girl. Neither had a strong preference, though Vaughn occasionally spoke of teaching a son to ride and rope, while Victoria sometimes imagined reading stories to a daughter. 3 days later, as dawn was breaking over the eastern mountains, Victoria woke to a sharp pain across her abdomen. She lay still, waiting to see if it would recur. When it did, some 10 minutes later, she knew her time had come. "Vaughn," she said, touching his shoulder gently, "I think the baby is coming." He was instantly alert, sitting up with an expression of mingled excitement and alarm. "Are you sure? Should I go for Mrs. Thompson now?" Victoria nodded. "Yes, but don't panic. First babies often take their time. We should have hours yet." Vaughn dressed quickly, his movements efficient despite his obvious concern. "I'll saddle Thunderbolt, he's fastest. I can be at Thompson's in 30 minutes if I push him." Before leaving, he helped Victoria from the bed and made sure she was comfortably settled in her rocking chair. He built up the fire, filled the kettle, and placed everything she might need within easy reach. "I'll be back as quickly as possible," he promised, kissing her forehead. "Buck will stay with you." The dog, sensing something important was happening, settled at Victoria's feet with an unusually solemn expression. After Vaughn left, Victoria focused on breathing through the pains, which were still relatively mild and spaced far apart. She thought of the baby they would soon meet, the child created from their unexpected love. Would it have Vaughn's blue eyes, her auburn hair? Mrs. Thompson arrived 2 hours later, bustling into the cabin with capable efficiency, Vaughn close behind her carrying her bag of supplies. "Well now, let's see how things are progressing," the older woman said, shooing Vaughn out of the bedroom while she examined Victoria. "First babies can take their time, so don't be discouraged if it's a long day." And a long day it was. Victoria's labor progressed slowly but steadily throughout the morning and into the afternoon. Mrs. Thompson remained calm and reassuring, offering encouragement and practical help. Vaughn alternated between pacing outside the bedroom door and sitting beside Victoria, holding her hand through the increasingly intense pains. As evening approached, Victoria's labor intensified dramatically. Mrs. Thompson nodded with satisfaction. "Won't be long now, the baby's getting ready to meet you." Vaughn, pale but determined, stayed by Victoria's side, supporting her through each contraction, wiping her brow with a cool cloth, murmuring words of love and encouragement. "You're the strongest person I know," he told her as she gripped his hand through a particularly powerful contraction. "You can do this, we're almost there." Just as the first stars appeared in the evening sky, with one final, tremendous effort, Victoria brought their child into the world. The baby's indignant cry filled the cabin, strong and healthy. "A girl," Mrs. Thompson announced, quickly cleaning and wrapping the infant, "a beautiful little girl." She placed the tiny bundle in Victoria's arms. Through tears of exhaustion and joy, Victoria looked down at her daughter's face, red and wrinkled, with a surprising amount of dark hair. "Hello, little one," she whispered. "We've been waiting for you." Vaughn sat on the edge of the bed, his expression one of absolute wonder as he gazed at his wife and newborn daughter. When Victoria offered the baby to him, his large, capable hands were remarkably gentle as he cradled his child. "She's perfect," he said, his voice rough with emotion, "just like her mother." Mrs. Thompson busied herself with cleaning up, giving the new family a moment of privacy. "Have you thought of a name?" she asked eventually. Victoria and Vaughn exchanged a look. They had discussed several possibilities over the winter months, but hadn't settled on a final choice. "Eleanor," Victoria said softly, "after my mother." "Eleanor Rose Ryder," Vaughn added. "Rose for the wildflowers that were blooming when you arrived here." Mrs. Thompson nodded approvingly, a fine name for a Montana girl. After ensuring that both mother and baby were resting comfortably, Mrs. Thompson prepared to leave, promising to return the following day. Young Thompson would stay in the barn overnight, she said, just in case they needed to send for her again. When they were finally alone, Vaughn stretched out on the bed beside Victoria, one arm around her shoulders, his other hand gently touching their sleeping daughter's cheek. "Thank you," he said simply, "for answering my advertisement. For coming west, for loving me despite all my rough edges, for giving me a family." Victoria leaned against his strength, exhausted but profoundly content. "And thank you for finding me at that train station. For bringing me to this beautiful place, for showing me what real partnership and real love can be." Outside, the stars shone bright over the Montana Valley, illuminating the ranch they had built together. Inside, the fire burned low in the hearth, casting a gentle glow over the family who had found in each other what neither had dared hope for, not just security or practicality, but a love that had transformed them both. Eleanor Rose Ryder slept peacefully in her mother's arms, unaware that her story had begun with an abandoned bride at a train station and a lonely rancher who had taken a chance on love. Her journey, their journey together, was just beginning.